love worldview stuff. What I think is the hard thing for us to appreciate is those of us who are traditionalists. I'm 52. I grew up in church, evangelicalism. I bring my own cultural presuppositions to the table that if I don't understand what they are, it's difficult for me to translate missiologically my context into a youth context.
Sure.
Because frankly, that is as different a culture as some are from the West in translating the gospel to Ghana or to Tanzania. There are as many differences in cultural presuppositions as there were from the West translating the gospel to the East. So the hard thing for me to give up is we have not offered this youth culture much more than hyper-rationalism from the Enlightenment, hyper-individualism from our own American culture. And I think, frankly, part of what they're reacting to is this very thin diet we as traditionalists have offered them and called it the gospel. We haven't illustrated a community of love that Christ asked us to offer. We haven't understood in the sense that our diet that we've offered has been insufficient to live in the current secular world. So I just think, I mean, confirming what you're saying, we just have to understand that we're not going to be any more effective by taking our own traditional assumptions and trying to broadcast them into a youth culture which is radically different from its own presuppositions.
Sure.
I'm not a big TV watcher. Happily, I caught the Super Bowl, one of the first entertaining Super Bowls in the history of National Football League. But you can see Friends or Seinfeld any time of day, and what it tells me is that this youth culture, they have a worldview where truth comes from the small, non-traditional community in which they find themselves. Their worldview is generated not by rational presuppositions or doctrinal content from a sermon. It's community and relationally driven, and that's not bad, because we've offered a very anti-communitarian, hyper-rationalistic message. So I love what you're talking about. I think it's very important. But we have to understand that to translate this message into the current youth culture, we have to be as missionally targeted as we would be if we were leaving the West and promoting the gospel in the East, because the cultural differences between a traditionalist like me and my own teenagers is as wide a gap culturally as it is from the West to the East.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I don't know if you want me to comment on that, if you just wanted to let that stand.
But I'll turn that into a question.
Okay, please turn that into a question.
Part of the problem is the culture that you have talked about.
Mm-hmm.
I would say part of the problem is the tradition that we have put inside the church that is ourselves and is not really reflective of the truth. I think part of the reason they don't get it is because there's not that much to get in terms of the traditional way. I mean, you yourself said it.
Which
you said,
said,
the quote was, there's other ways to be happy that do not involve going and listening to a boring sermon.
Yep.
So I think part of the problem is the quote, boring sermon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And what Charlie said here was actually true in a lot of ways. Here's the thing that certainly has been the kind of the Achilles heel of when you talk about worldview and that sort of thing, is that it does have a history of coming out of the West, certainly. But we could translate to use the language of culture or narratives or cultural narratives or anything like that. The thing that the Bible offers, though, that we have to start with, and this is what I meant when I said we know biblical content, but we don't think biblically. I'm suggesting that the thing that we need to understand is that let me back up. The thing that's unique about Christianity and the biblical story is that in the whole context of the biblical story, you start from Genesis 1 through 11, and it lays down the truth about the whole world. It's dealing with the whole world. The first man and woman, the first culture, the first civilization, the first cleansing, the first big judgment of God on a large scale, the first rebuilding of culture. And then, after the scatter of the nations, you have God choosing one nation, promising to bless all of the nations. So you have this, and that, by the way, gets fulfilled in an Acts. So you have this context, this big story of all cultures, through all people, all countries, all cultures, through which the promise of re-blessing all cultures, because that's what human beings were created for, to be in fellowship and relationship with God and so on, that through Israel then comes again application of the gospel to all cultures. So while I agree that certainly the gospel has been translated and retranslated from culture to culture to culture, and I think we are profoundly more Western than Christian, I think especially in the idea that we've made the sermon the talking head portion, and that's the focal point. I think we're more Western in the fact that we've separated faith and reason. So you have unfortunately, the feeling time, which is the singing, which tends to model pagan worship, which checked out the brain and became ecstatic utterances, unfortunately in a lot of cases. And then you have the sermon, which then divorces itself from emotion sometimes. Now I'm going to come back to that in just a second. And so it's more Western than not. And then you have the gospel, for example. I was just talking with some people, the gospel growing in Korea and their missiology and so on. They're dealing with this now. It's really fun. I mean, sometimes the Korean missionaries, there's a lot of cultural stuff going on with that as well. They're the biggest mission sending nation in the world, and this is what they're doing. So that's the good news. The challenge is their cultural assumptions that they're bringing to it. But wherever you say, you cannot say that truth is culturally contingent. Once you say that, you lose the truth. You can't say the truth of God is culturally contingent. Somehow, God has given us the scriptures. And according to Jesus' approach, his impression of what the scriptures were, they're true outside of culture or above culture. So the challenge is, as an incarnational message, is not that we have to contextualize the truth or contextualize the gospel or contextualize the pattern or the approach to life. It's that we have to take the truth itself. We don't contextualize it to find the truth. We take the truth to contextualize it. So we bring our cultural assumptions. We don't escape those things. But that's what an inter-community conversation goes. That's why we have the history of the church, for example. Because we can't look at culture and say that they're all created equal. Cultures that love their neighbors are better than cultures that eat their neighbors. It's just, as Zechariah says, it's just really that simple. A culture that takes Christianity and mixes it with ancestor worship. There's something bad going on there, because whether you're in a culture that understands ancestor worship and has that as a heritage or not, there is no God but one. There's just one. Now, I often hear challenges of the church being hyper-rational and that sort of thing, and I can certainly see that in certain denominations. I don't see American evangelicalism as being overly rational. I see branches of it being overly rational, and certainly education, I think, has struggled with that, as someone who is in that context. But I mean, American evangelicalism, if you look at, for example, some recent folks writing out of Regent College, John Stackhouse, Craig Gay especially, that's their critique. John Stackhouse's thing is that American evangelicalism models a perpetual adolescence. We want what we want when we want feelings, that sort of thing. It's a brilliant message from someone who probably is uncomfortable with the worldview kind of approach even. I just can't see that we've over-engaged the mind with students. I mean, I work with them. They can't think. I don't think I do think that worldview studies are guilty of engaging the mind and divorcing it from life, as if you can check these beliefs off the list, then suddenly, okay, you're okay. You're living like a Christian if you can answer George Barna's questions. I don't think that either, because again, it's a view of the world and a view for the world. So I guess what I'm trying to say in all this, there's a lot to what you said. What I'm trying to engage here is that we would be amiss if we took the gospel for any less than it is. If by trying to react to maybe over-rationalization, we went away from that to cultural relativism. It certainly would be bad, too, if we reacted to over-emotionalism and went to over-rationalization. The gospel is what the gospel is. God is who God is. We humans are who humans are. And this is what's been the brilliance of the church. The thing that gives me faith in the church is studying the history of the church, because it has been translated, it has been contextualized, and we have learned. And we have overcorrected, and we have recorrected, but in a modern society, and especially a postmodern society, truth gets left out, or either spiritual truth gets left out of the context of truth in modernism, truth gets left out in postmodernism, and certainly history and what Christianity is and the gospel narrative gets left out in the name of contemporary relevance. The other thing too is part of that structure. Then I want to do one more thing that you thought of. I just remembered when you said translating it into their culture. That's absolutely true. It's funny. In my work